The plasma rounds tore through the cliffside, carving glowing scars into the rock as Lieutenant Larek Nolan ducked behind the jagged ridge. Dust clung to his face, sweat stung his eyes, and his pulse pounded like a war drum in his ears. "Cover fire! Left flank!" he shouted, and the two Zalari soldiers beside him hesitated before firing their sleek rifles into the valley below. Their aim was too clean, too mechanical. Larek adjusted his own rifle, leaned out halfway, and squeezed off 3 shots. One of the enemy drones burst in a shower of green sparks. "How are you so calm?" asked Vetra, one of the Zalari, her voice rising over the chaos. "I'm not calm," Larek barked. "I'm just used to messy situations." A thunderous crack echoed through the canyon and pain exploded in his right shoulder. Larek staggered back, slammed into the rock behind him, and slid down with a grunt. Blood soaked through his vest almost immediately. He pressed his left hand against the wound and hissed through clenched teeth. "Medic!" Vetra shrieked, scrambling toward him. The other Zalari, Soren, dropped his weapon and activated his comms. Larek groaned. "No, still got my legs, still got my left arm." "You're shot." Vetra crouched beside him, her eyes wide with panic. She fumbled with a device at her belt, calling for immediate evac. Larek reached for his rifle, his fingers slick with blood. "We're not clear yet. If you call a drop ship now, they'll just blow it up. You are bleeding out." Soren snapped, kneeling on Larek's other side. "This is critical trauma. You must remain still." Larek gritted his teeth. The pain was sharp, invasive, but his training had drilled into him what mattered most: stay in the fight if you can. He shoved himself upright with a gasp, the world spinning briefly, but his feet held. "Vetra, take my left flank." "Soren, suppressing fire on that ridge. I'll call for the drone barrage." "You should not be standing," Vetra said, her voice cracking. "I'm not dead yet," Larek growled, pushing past her. They moved. The enemy's fire intensified, but Larek barely noticed. Every step sent a bolt of agony through his shoulder, but the adrenaline masked just enough of it. He ducked into a collapsed tunnel entrance and pulled out the targeting beacon. He keyed in coordinates, then launched it skyward. A few seconds later, a deep rumble shook the valley. Dozens of micro-drones zipped through the air and rained fire on the enemy position. "That's our window," Larek yelled. "Move." They sprinted for the extraction point, a narrow ridge overlooking the shattered battlefield. The 3 reached it just as the dropship descended, its engines roaring. Larek collapsed onto the ramp, blood still leaking from the deep wound in his shoulder. Inside, the medics swarmed him. "Do not move," one of them, a slender Chirolin with translucent skin, commanded, scanning the injury. "He has been punctured. Hemorrhaging is severe. This is catastrophic." "I've had worse," Larek muttered, though his voice trembled now. The Chirolin medic's tendrils flared in alarm. "You have sustained metal projectile trauma. There is fragmentation inside. Your internal systems are damaged." "Yeah," Larek groaned, letting his head rest against the cold floor. "That's usually what bullets do." The Chirolin turned to the others. "He requires immediate neurostasis. We must induce coma for recovery." "No coma," Larek said, eyes fluttering. "I've still got a briefing to give. Then I'll nap. You will expire without intervention." Larek slowly turned his head toward her. "You ever seen a human take a bullet before?" The medic hesitated. "No." "Well," he coughed, "you're about to see what it looks like when we don't die instantly." The moment they docked with the command ship, Larek was rushed into surgery. The medics were frantic, horrified at the idea of a solid metal object tearing through soft tissue. Their species used energy weapons and avoided kinetic trauma altogether. They couldn't understand why anyone would use such primitive ammunition, let alone survive it. Larek lay on the table, barely conscious. A mask was placed over his face, and the lights above him blurred. When he woke up, he was in a medical bay, his shoulder wrapped tightly and immobilized. A steady ache throbbed through his body, and his throat felt dry. Zariel Kareen, the unit's human liaison officer, stood at the foot of the bed with crossed arms. "You're an idiot." Larek blinked slowly. "Nice to see you too. You went into a firefight with a kinetic rifle team. You knew what they used. Didn't think they'd get a clear shot." Zariel sighed. The medics were hysterical. One kept repeating, "He will liquefy internally," over and over. "Drama queens. You passed out 30 seconds after the dropship lifted off." Larek shifted and winced. "Guess I was due." A tall, blue-scaled doctor entered carrying a datapad. Lieutenant Nolan, your recovery will require at least 12 weeks. The projectile fractured your scapula and tore through muscle tissue. We have removed the fragments and stabilized the joint. 12 weeks. Larek muttered. Yes. You will begin physical therapy in 4 days. Zariel leaned closer. You're off the field, Larek. No arguments. He looked away, jaw tight. 12 weeks was an eternity in an active war zone. The next few days were filled with restless attempts to move before he was ready. The Chirulin medics monitored his vitals constantly. One of them, a short, pale one named here, hovered nervously every time Larek clenched his jaw in pain. You must not strain yourself, here insisted. The trauma you sustained was extensive. I know, Larek said, flexing his fingers slowly. This bullet, it is designed to rip apart tissue. We had to learn your anatomy from scratch to remove it. You did fine. I'm still here. Here looked unconvinced. We have never encountered a species that functions under such conditions. Well, you have now. At the 2-week mark, Larek was able to raise his arm halfway. The pain was constant and the physical therapy sessions were grueling. Here continued to hover, always anxious that the human would snap something or collapse mid-session. One day, during a routine exercise, Here stared at the screen tracking Larek's muscle regeneration. I do not understand, Here said. Your body is repairing itself faster than projections. Not fast enough, Larek muttered. You should be in hibernation. Yet you walk, lift, even run minimal simulations. Why? Larek looked at the tiny medic. Because I don't want to die the next time I'm out there. If I don't push now, I'll hesitate later. That's how you get killed. You are. Intentionally enduring pain to avoid future pain. He nodded. Pretty much. Here blinked slowly. That is deeply inefficient. Welcome to humanity. By week 6, Larek was able to hold a rifle again, though not for long. His muscles trembled after every session. Still, he pushed. He ran drills. He sat in tactical briefings, studied new terrain scans, and argued with Zariel when she tried to reassign him to logistics. You almost bled out, Larek. And I didn't. I'm still useful. You'll tear the wound open again. I'll be careful. You're not careful, you're reckless. He looked at her, worn but resolute. I'm not doing this because I want to be a hero. I'm doing it because we don't have enough people who know how to fight those drone teams. I know their patterns. I know how to counter them. Zariel clenched her jaw but said nothing. By week 10, he was cleared for light recon duty. The first time he dropped back onto a combat surface. Here nearly fainted watching from the command deck. Is he armed? Yes, Zariel said, arms crossed. But he was impaled. And now he's back. Larek crouched behind a dune, scanning the horizon with a scope. The drone team was setting up an ambush, same model as before, same staggered turret formation. He tapped his comm. Vetra, I've got them. Send the crawler team left. I'll mark their flank. Confirmed. As he moved, his shoulder ached, but it held. He crawled up the ridge, marked the position, then fell back. The crawler team hit the enemy from the side, disabling their relay before they could coordinate. When the battlefield was clear, Larek sat down heavily on a rock, sweat dripping from his brow. You did well, Vetra said, approaching him. No injuries? Nothing new. She looked at him for a moment. You bled so much the last time. I thought you would die. Me too, he said quietly. And yet you returned. He looked out at the horizon. Because I had to. The shuttle touched down on a barren plateau under low cloud cover, the sky the color of old metal. Larek stepped onto the cracked surface, boots crunching against mineral shards left by years of erosion. The wind was dry and fast, kicking up sharp gusts that tugged at his jacket as he adjusted the sling on his left arm. The joint was functional, but the muscles still groaned if he moved too suddenly or too far. Vetra lowered her visor and scanned the terrain. Atmospheric readings are fluctuating. We won't get a clean aerial scan. Perfect, Larek said. Means they can't either. A narrow trench system ran along the northern ridge. The last recon drone had caught a blurry image of heat signatures threading through the cracks, likely mercenary scouts paid by one of the rogue constellations trying to carve up the demilitarized zone. Soren dropped into the trench first, his long limbs folding easily into the descent. Larek followed, suppressing the twinge in his shoulder as he braced against the edge. Pain flared, but he didn't slow down. 2 corridors in, he raised a hand. Hold. Hear that? Vetra stilled, listening. A soft scuff, then another. Close. Larek pointed up. A shadow darted across the opening overhead. Then a second. He slung the rifle around, flicked the safety off, and mouthed a count. 3, 2, 1. A figure dropped down from the ledge. Larek fired once. The bolt hit the attacker mid-chest, knocking them flat with a thud. 2 more followed, but Vetra and Soren were already moving. The sound of impact echoed as they drove the intruders back. One by one, the last one tried to flee back up the passage. Larek caught him by the collar and slammed him into the wall. "What's your deal?" he growled, pressing the barrel of his rifle against the alien's neck. The scout, a wiry, six-eyed humanoid with matte gray skin, gurgled in protest. Soren stepped in. Translation chips not registering this dialect. "Figures." Larek yanked a signal flare from the scout's belt and tossed it to Vetra. "Check the code. Might tell us who's paying them." Vetra scanned the flare with her wrist pad, then frowned. "Encrypted, but not well. I'll break it in a few minutes." "Do it on the move," Larek said. "We're not sitting ducks." They left the trench and took a rocky path leading toward a ravine. The scout groaned and thrashed at intervals, but Larek kept a tight grip on the back of his tunic. Halfway through the ravine, though, a sharp pull jolted Larek's shoulder. His grip faltered. The scout broke free. Soren raised his weapon, but Larek shouted, "No shots. We need him alive." The scout darted up a narrow crevice. Larek gave chase without thinking. The others shouted behind him, but the sound fell away as he pushed into the gap, feet slipping against loose gravel. The gap opened into a low cave. The scout stumbled to the far side and drew a blade. Larek didn't hesitate. He dropped low, swept the alien's legs, and pinned him under one knee. His shoulder flared with heat, but he gritted his teeth and twisted the blade out of the scout's hand with his good arm. "You're gonna sit still now," he said. They dragged the scout back to base camp just before sundown. Vetra had cracked the flare's encryption. "Looks like the funding came from a split faction in the Navari Trade Accord," she said, handing Larek the pad. "They're testing out proxy agents to see how we respond." "Then they just got their answer," Larek muttered. Later that night, after the scout was handed over to Central Command for interrogation, Larek sat in the field infirmary. His pulse was elevated, and the joint had started to swell again. He hadn't said anything during the mission, but now that the adrenaline had worn off, his entire left side throbbed with dull, rhythmic misery. A field surgeon, a short, broad-shouldered Acheron with 4 hands and a voice like melting wax, peeled back the compression wrap. "You ignored the strain warnings?" "I didn't have time for strain warnings. Your bursa sac is inflamed. Tissue stress beyond tolerances. You've disrupted the grafted fibrous layer." "I didn't tear anything. Not yet. Another jolt like that one, and you won't be lifting a fork." Larek exhaled slowly. "How long?" 3 days off field duty. Mandatory. I'll send the report myself." The Acheron applied a numbing gel that stung against the skin. Larek flinched but didn't pull away. "You humans are functionally reckless," the surgeon went on. "I've never seen a species so indifferent to pain thresholds. You treat them like guidelines. We just have a lot of practice." The surgeon snorted. "You treat trauma like a minor inconvenience." "It is, if you're lucky." The next morning, Larek was benched. He sat at the outpost's northern tower, watching a dust storm gather on the horizon. The sky flickered with static charges and the comms briefly dropped to half range. Vetra joined him, carrying a data chip. "I ran the proxy agent's last comm logs. They weren't just scouts," she said. "They were mapping weak points in the ravine system." Larek leaned forward. "For what? Tunnel burrowers? The kind that carry payloads? They're going to tunnel under our perimeter?" "Looks like it." He stood too fast and his shoulder protested immediately. He pressed his good hand against the wall, steadying himself. "You're grounded," she said. "I can still supervise a counter-rig. You'll ignore your limits again." He didn't answer. Instead, he pointed to a topographical map on his tablet. "They'll start here. Soft sediment, minimal resistance. I want traps laid along this corridor and seismic sensors on all 3 entries." She didn't argue. 2 hours later, they were in the tunnels. Larek moved slower this time, conscious of every step. He guided the engineering team to the correct fault lines and helped calibrate the trap triggers. Sweat beaded along his brow, and his left arm hung heavier than it should have, but he kept going. A tremor hit just as they finished placing the last seismic node. Not large, but sharp quick. "Something's coming," one of the engineers said, eyes wide. "Fall back now," Larek ordered. "Trigger the charges once I'm clear." "You're not cleared for sprinting." "I'm not sprinting. I'm moving fast with purpose." He ran. The tremor intensified. Dust rained from the ceiling. Behind them, a low grinding sound echoed metal against stone. The burrower. Larek vaulted onto the ridge just as the ground split behind him. The engineer hit the trigger. A series of thuds followed, and the tunnel collapsed in on itself. The shockwave threw Larek forward, and he landed hard, rolling to a stop. He lay still for a moment, blinking up at the fractured ceiling. Vetra's voice crackled through the comm. "Everyone clear?" Larek groaned. "Mostly." They extracted him an hour later. Back in the infirmary, the Acheron didn't even speak. He just stared, then began scanning. "The inflammation has doubled. You've torn the lower deltoid anchor." "Congratulations." Larek stared at the ceiling. "What's the new recovery time?" "Doesn't matter. You're not going back out there for at least a month." "I don't have a month." "You will if you don't want permanent nerve damage." Larek sat up slowly. "Can I at least coordinate ops from command?" The Acheron threw up two of his hands. "You people are allergic to common sense." Zariel entered without knocking. "He's going back to Central. Command's pulling him for reassignment." "What?" Larek swung his legs off the cot. "I'm still in this. You were in it. Now you're being reassigned as a tactical advisor. You've done enough." He stood, unsteady. "I didn't ask to be sidelined." Zariel's expression didn't change. "You didn't have to." The next morning, Larek boarded the transport back to Central with a fresh sling, a duffel bag, and a stiff limp. As the shuttle lifted off, he looked down at the ravine system, now silent and still. The traps they'd laid would hold. The tunnel had collapsed where it needed to. The burrowers had been stopped. He'd done what he could. For now. It took 6 days at Central before Larek Nolan stopped checking the mission board. The first 2, he told himself it was habit. By the third, it was reflex. On the 4th, he watched a squad rotate back from the outer perimeter with torn armor and field-worn gear and something in his chest pulled taut. On the 5th, he tried to sit through a briefing on fleet logistics and nearly walked out when someone asked if humans could be trained to require less rest between deployments. By the 6th day, he accepted what he already knew. He was grounded. Not benched. Not rotated. Grounded. Zariel found him reorganizing the tactical maps in the war room, eyes red from lack of sleep and fingers stained with grease from a malfunctioning holoprojector he'd refused to report. "You're not doing yourself any favors," she said. "I'm not trying to." He didn't look up. "I'm trying to stay useful." She crossed her arms and leaned against the console. "You've already been useful. You bought us quiet in the southern corridor. The traps are still holding. The tunnel teams haven't tried again." He nodded without answering. "You know," she added, "most humans would have taken the clearance and left the front by now. Gone home. I don't have a home that isn't on the front." There was no reply to that. She left him to the maps. 3 more days passed. The shoulder, bound in a new carbon weave brace, had stopped aching constantly. Now it only hurt when he reached too far or twisted without warning. The physical therapist, a tall insectoid with a patient demeanor and an endless supply of passive-aggressive comments, had started letting him work resistance bands again. "You don't have to prove anything anymore," the therapist said during one session, adjusting the tension on the brace. "You walked into a blast wave with a half-healed shoulder and came out vertical. That's not recovery. That's self-sabotage." "I'm not trying to prove anything," Larek said, pulling the band across his chest with a grimace. "I'm trying to stop thinking about how quiet the war's gotten without me in it." The therapist didn't answer. He just handed Larek the next band. By the end of the 2nd week at Central, Larek had memorized the layout of the entire command sector. He started waking up earlier than regulation drills, and ran the perimeter of the compound. The 3rd morning, he found a security officer waiting near the gate, arms folded. "You don't have clearance to leave the boundary," the officer said. "I'm not leaving," Larek replied, brushing past. "I'm keeping the edge in sight." He ran the full loop, shoulder throbbing, lungs burning, and didn't stop until sunrise lit the clouds in bruised orange and green. At noon, Zariel called him to the observation chamber. The room was cold, lined with layered screens and a curved glass wall overlooking the docking bay. A single chair sat in the center. She didn't ask him to sit. "There's a delegation from the Celt Dominion arriving in 2 hours," she said. "They want a demonstration of our adaptability protocols." He frowned. Why would they want that? Because they've been watching our casualty stats. Human units have the lowest mortality rate under direct fire conditions. They want to know why. "So you're going to show them a slideshow of us getting shot and not dying?" "No. I'm going to have you walk them through a reconstruction of the trench op full sensory playback." Larek blinked. "You want me to relive the time I got shot and dragged a bleeding arm through a drone ambush?" "Yes." He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, "Fine. But I want full access to the playback feeds. If I'm doing this, I'm doing it right." 2 hours later, the Celt arrived, a trio of tall crystalline entities whose voices rang in layered chimes and whose eyes were pulses of shifting color. They refused chairs, preferring to hover in ambient suspension. Larek stood in front of the projection dome, braced and calm. Zariel activated the playback. The trench flickered into view, three-dimensional and immersive. Larek's own breathing filled the speakers. The sound of drone fire echoed. The moment the bullet hit replayed in stunning clarity. One of the Celt pulsed violet. "Why did you continue?" "I had a team to protect," Larek answered. "You were damaged. I was still able to function." "Your species prioritizes output over recovery?" "No," he pointed to the moment he called the drone barrage. "We prioritize outcomes. I knew if I stopped, they'd die. So I didn't stop." Another ripple of sound from the Celt. "What was the pain quotient?" "High. You endured without sedation. Sedation would have slowed me. I needed to stay alert." The playback moved to the extraction. The Celt observed the wound, the blood loss, the movement patterns. One of them shifted hue again. "You continued sensory engagement despite neural overload?" "I didn't have another option." The third Celt, who had remained silent, pulsed a soft harmonic. "This is not resilience. This is refusal." Larek looked at them evenly. "You're right. We refuse to die when we're not finished." They hovered in silence for several seconds. Then the projection ended. Zariel stepped forward. "Will this satisfy your council?" "We will return with this data," the lead one said. "There is recalibration required in our assessments." After they left, Zariel turned to him. "You just redefined human resilience as obstinate refusal." He shrugged. Wasn't wrong. Later that night, he returned to the gym, but this time he didn't use the resistance bands. Instead, he stood in the center of the room, slow breathing, shoulder relaxed. He closed his eyes and replayed the trench from memory, not the violence, not the injury, but the decision. The moment he chose to keep moving. The next morning, the therapist cleared him for full arm rotation drills. No weight yet, but the motion was smooth. The scar tissue had healed. The inflammation had receded. He could feel the strength returning, not fast, but real. Zariel found him in the exercise yard after lunch. This time, she didn't open with a warning. "They approved your request," she said. "You're being reassigned to the Frontier Defense Academy. Advisor track." He looked up. "Training? New units. Mixed species. They want someone who's seen close quarters trauma and kept fighting." He nodded once. "When do I leave?" 2 days. Transport scheduled." He exhaled slowly. "You know they won't listen. Not at first. Then make them remember." 2 days later, Larek stood on the edge of the Academy's training field, watching a line of recruits struggle through a live fire tunnel simulation. A human stumbled, caught off balance. A Varnic recruit stopped to help. A drone turret tagged them both. He paused the simulation. Again, he called out. "This time, you don't stop moving. And you don't wait to be told when it's bad enough to keep going." One of the recruits raised a hand. "Sir, how do we know when we've hit our limit?" "You don't," Larek said. "You just learn to move the line." He watched them reset. The tunnel flickered. The sequence began again. This time, nobody stopped.